A man with a scar, through his eyebrow and tattoos covering both arms, walked into a diner at sunrise, set a thick envelope on the counter, and said 5 words to the 63-year-old woman behind it. "You don't remember me." Inside that envelope was every debt she owed paid in full, the deed to her building free and clear, and a promise made 29 years ago by a 7-year-old boy she had fed for 9 days and then lost forever. This is that story. She had 48 hours before the bank took everything. Margaret Dawson stood behind the counter of Dawson's Diner at 4:17 in the morning with a piece of paper in her hand that smelled like the inside of a government envelope. The fluorescent light above the grill had been flickering for 3 weeks. She hadn't fixed it. She hadn't fixed a lot of things. The paper said what papers like that always say when someone with money decides that someone without money has occupied space long enough. Foreclosure. 40 years of coffee. 40 years of knowing every regular by name, every birthday, every funeral, every first day of school that a mother mentioned over eggs and toast. 40 years of this diner being the heartbeat of a town that had been slowly forgetting she existed. And now a man named Victor Hale, a man who had never once sat at her counter, had purchased her debt from the bank and was moving to claim the building by Friday. 2 days. She set the paper on the counter next to a ceramic mug that still had yesterday's coffee dried in a ring at the bottom. A flannel shirt hung on the hook by the back office door, green and brown plaid. It was not the original, not the one Thomas had worn, but it was the same color and the same pattern, and it had been hanging on that hook for almost 30 years because the hook could not be empty. She had never been able to let the hook be empty. The diner was dark. The town was dark. The road outside hadn't seen headlights in over an hour. A dog barked somewhere 2 blocks over. The ice machine in the back hummed the way it always hummed, steady and low, the only sound in the building that never stopped. She had thought about unplugging it once years ago during a stretch when the electric bill was more than the weekly take. She didn't, because unplugging things felt like a kind of giving up, and Margaret Dawson did not give up on things. She just held on until her hands bled, and then held on some more. Then the engines came. Not one, not two. 6 Harley-Davidsons rolling into her parking lot at the edge of sunrise. The sound hit her chest before it reached her ears. Low heavy, the kind of rumble that vibrates through floor tile and rattles the old ceramic mugs on their hooks behind the counter. 6 machines, 6 riders, chrome catching the first gray light of morning like a row of knives laid flat. The man who stepped off the lead bike moved slowly. He was large in a way that had nothing to do with height. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the arms, the kind of build that comes from decades of lifting things heavier than most people touch. His head was shaved on the sides, dark gray hair, slicked back on top in an undercut that made the angles of his face look carved rather than grown. A beard, white-gray, thick, hung to the center of his chest. Both forearms and both arms were covered in dense dark ink tribal patterns, and Celtic knots layered so tight they looked like sleeves made of shadow. He wore a black leather vest, no shirt beneath it, multiple patches, a red emblem badge over the left chest. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent more years gripping wrenches and handlebars than holding anything soft. Large hands, strong hands. There was a scar running clean through his left eyebrow, like someone had drawn a line there and meant it. A small gauge piercing in one ear. His face was the contradiction. The body said danger. The eyes said something else. Something warm. Something patient. Something that had been waiting a very long time to walk through this door. He pushed open the front door of the diner. The little bell above it rang once. He looked around the room the way a man looks around a room when he is checking it against a memory he has carried for decades. His eyes moved across the counter, the stools, the window where the morning light was just beginning to touch the glass. He looked at the specials board. He looked at the corner booth. He looked at the hook by the back office door. He saw the flannel shirt. He stopped. For 2 full seconds, the largest man in the room did not breathe. His jaw tightened. His hands, which had been loose at his sides, closed once and opened again. Something moved across his face that was too fast and too deep to be called an expression. It was more like weather, a front passing through. Then he walked to the counter, set down a thick envelope, and spoke in a voice that did not need volume to fill every corner of that diner. "You don't remember me, but I remember what you did." Maggie Dawson looked at the envelope. She looked at his hands. She looked at the scar through his eyebrow and the ink covering his arms and the vest with its patches and colors. Her own hands were still holding the foreclosure notice. She had forgotten she was holding it. The two pieces of paper, the one from the bank and the one from this man, sat in the same room now, and only one of them was going to matter by the end of this morning. She did not recognize him. He said, "You gave me a flannel shirt in July of 1994. You let me sleep in your storage room for 9 days. You poured me orange juice twice without me asking. And when they came to take me, I told you I'd pay you back." The fluorescent light above the grill flickered. Once, twice, then held steady. "My name was Nathan," he said, and the room tilted. Because 29 years ago, in the summer of 1994, a 7-year-old boy whispered those words to this woman. And today a man named Nate Archer, full-patch member of a Hells Angels chapter, had ridden 600 miles to keep a promise he made when he was too young to tie his shoes properly. This is that story, and it begins the way all stories like this begin, with one person showing up for another when nobody else would. Let's go back. Summer of 1994. A small town in America that nobody outside a 50-mile radius had ever heard of. The kind of town where the post office and the diner shared a wall, where the high school football field was the only thing that got mowed on a regular schedule, where people measured time not by years, but by floods, by funerals, by which winter was the one that cracked the water main. The storefronts on Main Street were half occupied. A hardware store that had been a hardware store for 60 years was now a hardware store that was also a bait shop, because neither business alone could keep the lights on. The barber still cut hair 3 days a week in a chair his father had bolted to the floor in 1961. The gas station had 2 pumps, one of which worked. The town had no stoplight. It had a blinking yellow caution signal at the one intersection that mattered, and even that felt like an overstatement. Margaret Dawson was 34 years old that summer, and she had already buried enough for a woman twice her age. Her husband Thomas had died 3 years prior. Heart attack, 41 years old. He had been the kind of man who fixed things around the house without being asked. The kind who never once raised his voice in 11 years of marriage. The kind who would get up on a Sunday morning and drive 40 minutes to buy a part for the dishwasher because he had noticed it was draining slow, and he didn't want Maggie to have to think about it. He left her the diner, a mortgage, and the flannel shirt she found in the laundry the morning after the funeral. It was green and brown plaid, soft in the way that flannel gets soft after 100 washes, and it smelled like him. Like coffee and motor oil and whatever soap he used that she had never paid attention to until it was the only thing left that carried his scent. She hung it on the hook by the back office door. She told herself she would move it when she was ready. She never was. She ran Dawson's Diner alone, up at 4, last out at 9, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. She knew every regular by their order before they sat down. Scrambled eggs, dry toast, coffee. Black for Earl Hadley, who had been coming in since before Thomas died and who always left a dollar tip folded under his plate like it was a secret between him and the counter. 2 over-easy biscuit, extra butter for the Purcell brothers, Hank and Dale, who sat in the same booth every morning and argued about weather and football and nothing, which is what brothers argue about when what they really mean is, "I'm glad you're here." She gave credit to people who could not always pay it back. She remembered birthdays. She asked about surgeries. She carried plates with her left hand and grief with everything else, and she did it without complaint because complaint required an audience, and Margaret Dawson did not perform her pain for anyone. She was not rich. She was not even comfortable. But she showed up. Every single day. She showed up. The boy appeared on a Tuesday in late July. He was sitting on the curb outside the front door when she unlocked it at 5:30 in the morning. The sky was still gray, the air already warm in the way that July air gets warm in the south before the sun even clears the tree line, the kind of warm that sits on your skin and doesn't move. And there on the concrete sat a child who looked like something the night had decided not to finish. 7 years old, thin in a way that was not natural. Not the thinness of a child who runs too much and eats too fast. The thinness of deprivation. His collarbone pressed against his skin like it was trying to escape. Arms that had bruises in the kind of places that do not come from falling off bicycles. The inside of the upper arm, the back of the neck, the places that clothes cover. The places that adults choose when they do not want other adults asking questions. He was too quiet. That was the thing Maggie noticed first. Not shy, not sleepy. Quiet in the way that children become quiet when they have learned through repetition that making noise brings consequences. His body was still in a way that children's bodies are not supposed to be still. Controlled, watchful, ready. His eyes tracked her hand as she reached for the door key. Not her face, her hand. Because a child who has been hit learns to watch hands the way a soldier learns to watch tree lines. His name was Nathan Archer, and his mother Sarah was dying 2 towns over in the county hospital. Heart failure. 31 years old, a woman whose body had given out the way bodies give out when life has been doing the work of a disease long before the disease arrives. Sarah Archer had been working 2 jobs since Nathan was 3. Waitressing mornings, cleaning offices at night. She slept 4 hours when she slept at all. Her heart, the actual muscle, had been operating on a deficit for years, pumping blood through a body that never got enough rest, never got enough food, never got enough of anything except the particular kind of exhaustion that poverty manufactures on an industrial scale. Nathan had walked 4 miles in the dark to reach the diner because his mother had told him once during one of the good days, the days when she could sit up and hold his hand without her fingers trembling, that the woman who ran Dawson's Diner was kind. That was the word she used. Kind. Not nice. Not friendly. Kind. And a child who has been given very little learns to hear the difference between those words, even when the adults around him cannot. Nice is a performance. Friendly is a temperature. Kind is a decision. It is the choice to act on behalf of someone else when there is no audience and no reward and no reason except that the acting is the right thing to do. Maggie did not ask a lot of questions that first morning. She looked at the boy. She looked at the bruises he did not know she could see. She looked at his eyes, which were looking at her the way a dog at a shelter looks at the hand reaching through the cage. Not with hope exactly. With the last thing before hope runs out. She said 4 words. Sit down. Eat first. She put a plate in front of him. Eggs, toast, a glass of orange juice. He ate like he had not eaten in some time. Not fast. Careful. The way someone eats when they have learned that food can be taken away and they want to remember the taste of every bite in case it is the last. He cleaned the plate. He used the edge of his toast to push the last bit of egg onto his fork, a gesture that was practiced and precise, the gesture of a child who has been taught by hunger to waste nothing. She refilled his orange juice without him asking. Twice. The regulars that morning glanced over at him. Earl Hadley looked. He looked for a long time, his coffee mug held 2 inches from his lips. Not drinking, just looking. The Purcell brothers looked. Hank nudged Dale and Dale shook his head, which was their way of having a conversation without words. Nobody said much, because in small towns, people understand certain silences. They know when a question would be a kindness and when it would be a cruelty. They saw a boy. They saw Maggie. They drank their coffee. That afternoon, she called the county hospital. It took 11 minutes to reach someone who could connect her to Sarah Archer's room. The hospital was understaffed. The hold music was a gospel station playing through a phone speaker that made every hymn sound like it was being sung inside a tin can. When Sarah finally answered, her voice was thin, paper thin, the voice of a woman whose lungs were filling with fluid she did not have the strength to cough out. Is he there? Sarah asked. That was her first question. Not how are you? Not who is this? Is he there? Maggie said yes. Sarah was too weak to sit up, but she was clear-eyed, lucid in the way that dying people sometimes become lucid, as if the body, knowing it is leaving, decides to give the mind one final stretch of perfect clarity so that whatever needs to be said gets said while there is still breath to carry the words. Don't let them send him back there, Sarah said. She was talking about the foster home Nathan had already been through once, a placement that nobody with authority had examined closely enough, a house where the checks arrived on time and the inspections were scheduled in advance and the bruises were always in places that clothes covered. Please, Sarah said, he's a good boy. He doesn't deserve what's back there. There was a sound on the line that might have been a cough or might have been a swoon. With Sarah Archer at this point, the difference was medical rather than emotional. Both came from the same point. Both cost the same amount of air. Maggie made the promise. She said the words out loud, standing in the back office of the diner with the phone cord wrapped around her wrist and her dead husband's flannel shirt hanging on the hook 2 feet from her face. She said, "I will take care of him." And she meant it the way you mean something when you do not yet know what it will cost. For 9 days, Nathan Archer lived in the back of Dawson's diner. He slept on a folded stack of tablecloths in the storage room between the canned goods and the extra napkin boxes. Maggie had put a pillow there, a real pillow from her own bed, because the storage room had no windows, and she wanted him to have at least one thing that felt like someone had thought about his comfort. She had also put a small reading lamp on an upturned crate beside the tablecloths, even though she didn't know if the boy could read yet, because a room with a light that you control is different from a room where someone else decides when it goes dark. He ate 3 real meals a day. Breakfast at the counter before the regulars came when the diner was quiet, and the only sound was the grill warming up and the coffee machine doing its work. Lunch in the back when the rush was on a plate that Maggie would set on the prep table with a napkin and a fork, placed exactly the way she placed settings for paying customers, because the boy was not a charity case and she would not let him feel like one. Dinner after close when Maggie would sit across from him at the corner booth and eat her own plate and not force conversation because she understood that silence for this boy was not absence. It was safety. He helped, without being asked. He wiped down tables. He stacked chairs. He swept the floor with a broom that was taller than he was, moving through the diner with a kind of quiet focus, as if he was trying to take up as little space as possible while still being useful. As if being useful was the price of being allowed to stay. He organized the sugar packets at each table by color. He straightened the salt and pepper shakers so they stood in perfect rows. Small acts of order from a child whose life had contained very little of it. On the third night, Maggie gave him the flannel shirt. She took it off the hook herself. Her hands did not shake, but something behind her sternum shifted when she did it, something she had been holding in place for 3 years. She brought it to the storage room where Nathan was sitting on his stack of tablecloths with his arms wrapped around his knees, making himself as small as a 7-year-old body can be, which is very small indeed. "The nights get cool," she said. "This was my husband's." He put it on. It fell past his knees. The sleeves hung 6 inches beyond his fingertips. He looked like a child wearing a small tent. He did not take it off. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not for the rest of the 9 days. He wore it like armor. Like the fabric itself was the thing keeping him together. He slept in it. He ate in it. He swept the floors in it with the sleeves rolled up 5 times so his hands could reach the broom handle. And Maggie watched him uncurl. Slowly. The way a hand opens after it has been clenched so long, the fingers have forgotten any other shape. She saw him laugh once on day 6 at something Earl Hadley said about a raccoon in a trash can. It was a small laugh, surprised, like he had not expected the sound to come out of his own mouth. His hand went to his lips afterward as if he was checking to make sure the sound hadn't broken something. She saw him start to look at her when she entered the room instead of looking at the exits. She saw him reach for the orange juice pitcher once and then stop himself because reaching for things was not something he did. And then she saw him look at her and she nodded, and he poured himself a glass and drank it, standing at the counter with the flannel shirt hanging off his shoulders like a cape. She let herself believe. She called the county office. She asked about emergency foster certification. She filled out forms at the kitchen table after closer handwriting, getting smaller and neater the more carefully she tried, as if penmanship could make the difference between keeping a child and losing one. She believed that love and stubbornness and the right phone call at the right time might be enough. Day 9. The car pulled into the parking lot at 8:45 in the morning. A county sedan, clean, nondescript, the kind of car that has no personality, because personality is not part of its function. 2 people inside. Maggie saw it through the front window, and her hands stopped moving over the counter she had been wiping. She knew. The body knows before the mind catches up. The body feels the weight of certain arrivals the way it feels a change in barometric pressure. Something inside her dropped. Judith Pruitt stepped out of the passenger side. Mid-40s, gray blazer over a white blouse, hair pulled back in a way that was efficient rather than fashionable. She carried a clipboard, and she moved with the particular efficiency of a woman who had done this exact walk hundreds of times. Not unkind, not cruel, Professional in the way that professionals become professional when they have learned to build a wall between what they feel and what they are required to do. Her shoes were practical. Her face was composed. Everything about her said, I am here to do a job, and that work does not include your feelings. The second worker stayed by the car. He leaned against the driver's door with his arms crossed. Watching the front of the diner, a man whose job was to be present in case things went sideways, which in his experience they sometimes did. Judith entered the diner. She looked at Nathan, who was wiping a table near the window. He had frozen when the sedan pulled in. His hand still held the cloth, but the hand was not moving. His body had gone rigid in the way that his body went rigid, the survival posture, the stillness that comes from knowing exactly what a county car looks like and exactly what it means. She looked at Maggie, who was standing behind the counter with a dish towel in her hand and an expression that was already pleading before a single word had been spoken. Mrs. Dawson, Judith said, we received a report. A report. Someone had called. Someone in this town, someone who had seen the boy. Someone who had watched Maggie feeding him and housing him and caring for him for 9 days had picked up a telephone and called Child Protective Services. Judith explained the situation clearly. Legally, Maggie had no standing, no foster license, no formal custody arrangement, no kinship claim. What she had been doing, however well-intentioned, could be classified as harboring a minor without legal authority. She used a specific word. She used it once carefully, and she watched Maggie's face when she said it. Kidnapping. She said it softly. She said it the way a person says a word when they know the word is a weapon and they are choosing to show it rather than use it. But the showing was enough. Maggie understood what she was being told. She had a diner. She had a mortgage. She had a life she had built on staying inside the lines. One word and one report could take all of it. She made the responsible decision. She hated herself for it before she even finished making it. Nathan did not cry when they walked him to the car. He did not yell. He did not grab the door frame. He did not reach for Maggie. He had been through this before. His body knew the choreography, the walk to the car, the hand on the top of his head guiding him into the back seat, the click of the seatbelt, the door closing with that particular sound that county car doors make solid and final, a sound designed to separate one world from another. But at the last moment he turned, he pressed his small face against the rear window, and he looked at Maggie with eyes that were absolutely steady, not angry, not broken, just watching. The way a child looks when he has already learned not to be surprised by adults failing him. The way a child looks when he is memorizing a face he believes he will never see again. His lips moved. Maggie could not hear him through the glass, but she could read the words. I'll pay you back one day. The car pulled away. The parking lot was empty. The morning light was full now, and it made everything look clean and ordinary, which is what morning light does to the places where terrible things have just happened. A bird landed on the railing outside. The coffee machine finished its cycle. The world continued as if nothing had changed, which is the most brutal thing the world does. Maggie stood in the doorway. The dish towel was still in her hand. She did not go back inside for a long time. That night, the telephone rang at 11:14. Maggie was sitting at the kitchen table in her apartment above the diner. She had not eaten. She had not changed clothes. She was staring at the emergency foster application she had been filling out, the one that was now useless, the one covered in her careful handwriting that had not been careful enough, fast enough, official enough. The pen was still in her hand. She had been holding it for 2 hours without writing a word. The voice on the phone was a hospital administrator, efficient, tired. The voice of someone delivering news they have delivered many times and who has learned to do it in a tone that is neither cold nor warm, but somewhere in the narrow space between the space where professionals store the things they cannot afford to feel. Sarah Archer had passed at 9:47 that evening. Heart failure, 31 years old. Nathan was an orphan now. Maggie set the phone back in its cradle. She sat at the table. The apartment was quiet. Below her, the diner was dark. The flannel shirt was missing from the hook because it was on a 7-year-old boy in a county car somewhere she could not reach. And the hook where it had hung for 3 years was empty, and the emptiness of that hook was the emptiness of everything. She called Child Protective Services at 6 the next morning. The office opened at 8, but she called at 6 because she could not wait any longer. She called again at 7. At 8:02, she reached someone. She asked for Judith Pruitt. She was told Miss Pruitt was in the field. She asked about Nathan Archer. She said his name clearly. She spelled it. The woman on the other end of the line typed something, paused, typed again, then said in a tone that was perfectly neutral, "That file has been transferred to another county. I'm not able to share placement information with non-family members." Maggie said she wanted to apply for emergency foster custody. The woman said she would need to speak with a caseworker. Maggie said she had been trying to speak with a caseworker for 9 days. The woman said someone would call her back. Nobody called back. Not that day, not the next. Maggie drove to the county CPS office on Thursday. She sat in the waiting room for 2 hours on a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor next to other plastic chairs occupied by other people who were also waiting for a system that was in no hurry to see them. When she finally reached a desk, the man behind it looked at his computer and told her that Nathan Archer's file had been reassigned and that due to confidentiality protocols, he could not disclose the child's current placement caseworker or location. She asked to file a formal request for foster consideration. He said the process typically takes 4 to 6 months. She said the boy did not have 4 to 6 months. He said he understood her concern and that the system was designed to protect children and that she should fill out the form and wait to be contacted. She filled out the form. She waited. She was never contacted. Nathan Archer disappeared into the system the way a stone disappears into water. A small ripple, then nothing. A file number. A case transferred. A child processed. The system had taken him, and the system had absorbed him, and the system had continued functioning exactly as it was designed to function, which is to say it had moved a child from one place to another and called it resolution and closed the file and moved on to the next one. Maggie put a piece of paper in the window of Dawson's Diner. She wrote it by hand in letters large enough to read from the sidewalk. "Missing Nathan Archer, 7 years old. If you know where he is, please call." She put her phone number at the bottom. She taped it to the glass with packing tape so the rain would not smudge the ink. That piece of paper stayed in the window for 2 years, through 2 summers and 2 winters, and every rainstorm, and every morning when the sun hit the glass and made the ink fade a little more. She replaced it once when the paper started to yellow, writing the same words in the same hand, taping it to the same glass. Nobody ever called. And here's the part that Maggie did not learn until many years later. The part that turned a tragedy into something else. Something with teeth. The report to CPS, the phone call that brought Judith Pruitt to the diner on day 9, had not come from a concerned neighbor. It had not come from a teacher or a social worker or anyone whose job it was to worry about children. It came from Victor Hale. In 1994, Victor Hale was 31 years old. He had been buying property along the main corridor of town for 3 years, picking up buildings the way a man picks up cheap tools at an estate sale. One by one, patient, methodical. He wore polo shirts and khaki pants and drove a truck that was clean enough to suggest he didn't use it for truck things. He smiled easily. He shook hands firmly. He attended town council meetings and sat in the back and listened. And when he spoke, he used words like community and investment and growth, words that sound like promises but are not. He had already acquired the hardware store, the old movie theater, and 2 residential lots on the block behind the diner. Dawson's Diner sat on a corner lot with road frontage on 2 sides, the single most valuable piece of undeveloped commercial potential on the entire strip. He had approached Maggie twice about selling. Twice she had said no, politely, firmly. The diner was not for sale. It had her husband's name on it. It had her life inside it. It was not a piece of property. It was a pulse. Hale did not argue. He smiled. He said he understood. He left his card on the counter, both times placing it next to the register with 2 fingers, a gesture that said, "I am patient, and this card will still be here when you are not." Then a 7-year-old boy appeared, and Maggie Dawson made the mistake of caring for him without paperwork, and Victor Hale picked up the phone. He did not call because he was worried about a child. He called because a woman with a harboring complaint becomes a woman with leverage against her. A woman facing a CPS investigation becomes a woman who might be more willing to discuss the sale of a corner lot. A woman who has been reminded of her own vulnerability becomes a woman who understands that the world has rules, and the rules do not always protect the people who follow them. The CPS complaint was not about Nathan. It was never about Nathan. It was about the lot. That is who Victor Hale was, a man who looked at a 7-year-old child sleeping on tablecloths in a storage room and saw a piece of real estate leverage. A man who calculated with the cold precision of a developer reading a zoning map that a woman's love for a homeless boy could be converted into square footage. And 29 years later, the same man was back. Older now, 60, wealthier. The kind of wealth that comes with lawyers and county connections, and the quiet confidence of a man who has spent 3 decades learning that the system bends toward money the way water bends toward gravity. He had purchased Maggie's debt from the bank, medical bills from a surgery 2 years prior, a hip replacement that her insurance had fought for 4 months and then partially denied, leaving her with a balance that sat on her kitchen table beside the old foster application she had never thrown away. Credit card balances she had taken on to keep the diner's equipment running. A new compressor, a replacement grill top, the machines that kept the heartbeat going. Back property taxes that had been creeping upward at a rate that did not match any market in the county because the county assessor, a man named Boyd Sutter, had been adjusting the numbers in ways that served specific interests. Victor Hale had assembled a foreclosure case the way a man assembles a trap, patiently, legally, with the kind of precision that makes the cruelty invisible on paper. Every document filed correctly, every deadline met, every legal requirement satisfied. The trap was perfect. The trap was beautiful if you were the kind of person who found beauty in the machinery of destruction. 48 hours, that was what the envelope said. 48 hours before Dawson's Diner, the last heartbeat on a dying block stopped beating. And then the engines came. 6 Harley-Davidsons, 1 thick envelope, and a man with a scar through his eyebrow who had spent 29 years becoming the kind of person who could keep a promise a 7-year-old boy had no business making. But before we get to what was inside that envelope, before we get to the man Nathan Archer became, you need to understand what happened to the boy after that county car pulled away. You need to understand where the system sent him, what it cost him, and who he met in the darkest part of it. Because this story is not about a man saving a diner. It is about a woman who fed a hungry child for 9 days and had no idea that those 9 days would become the foundation of everything that came after. 9 days. A plate of eggs, a glass of orange juice refilled twice without asking, a flannel shirt that smelled like someone's husband. That was all it was. And to a 7-year-old boy who had been given nothing, it was everything. The county car that carried Nathan Archer away from Dawson's Diner on that July morning in 1994 made a left turn at the end of the block. He watched through the rear window until the diner disappeared behind the tree line. He did not wave. He did not press his hand to the glass. He just watched the way a person watches a shore receding from a boat they did not choose to board. Then he turned forward in his seat, folded his hands in his lap, and did not speak again for 3 hours. The caseworker in the front passenger seat made 2 phone calls during the drive. Both were about logistics. Neither was about Nathan. He listened to the woman use words like placement and availability and temporary hold, the way a person talks about storing furniture. He was 7 years old, and he already understood that in the language of the system, he was not a boy. He was a unit, something to be placed, something to be held, something that fit into a space or did not, and if it did not, someone made another phone call and found another space. The flannel shirt was still on his body. They had not taken it. He held the collar against his chin with one hand the way a child holds a blanket, and he breathed through the fabric. It smelled like the diner, like coffee and grill grease, and the particular soap Maggie used on the tables, something with lemon in it that cut through everything. His first foster home was a house on a cul-de-sac in a town 40 minutes from everything he had known. The family's name was Glanville. Husband, wife, 2 biological children who were older and louder and occupied every room like they owned the air inside it. The Glanvilles had been taking foster children for 6 years. They had the paperwork. They had the inspections. They had a bedroom at the end of the hall with a twin bed and a dresser with 1 drawer that stuck. What they did not have was interest. The checks arrived on the 1st of every month. The food began running out by the 3rd week. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would notice on a scheduled visit. Just slowly. The good cereal disappeared. Then the bread. Then the milk was watered down and dinner portions got smaller, and Nathan learned to eat everything on his plate in the first 60 seconds because the Glanville kids took whatever was left. He learned to eat the way animals eat in environments where food is contested territory. Fast, silent, with his arm curled around the plate. He went to school maybe half the time. Nobody tracked it. His teacher marked absences in a book that nobody read. He wore clothes that were too large because they had been donated and nobody had checked the size. The pants were held up with a piece of rope he had found in the garage. He slept in the room at the end of the hall and listened to the family on the other side of the house laughing at television shows, and the distance between their laughter and his silence was the exact distance between having a family and being stored in one. He stayed 11 months. Then the Glanvilles decided they wanted a younger child. Something about bonding windows, something about attachment metrics, words that meant the boy is too quiet and quiet children make us uncomfortable because they watch too closely. Nathan was transferred. The system moved him the way the system moves everything, efficiently, without consultation, a phone call, a car ride, a new dresser with a drawer that's stuck in a different way. Meanwhile, 29 years later, in 600 miles east, Margaret Dawson was sitting in the office of the only attorney in town who would see her without a retainer. His name was Gideon Foyle. He was 73 years old, semi-retired, and his office smelled like pipe tobacco and paper that had been sitting in the same filing cabinets since the Reagan administration. The carpet was the color of olives. A framed law degree from a state university hung on the wall behind his desk, slightly crooked, and the crookedness suggested a man who had stopped caring about impressions a long time ago and now cared only about facts. He read the foreclosure notice twice. He read the property tax assessments 3 times. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with the end of his towel, and put them back on. "The assessment is wrong," he said. "Maggie said she knew. Your property is valued here at 3 times the comparable lots on the same block. That doesn't happen by accident." Maggie said she knew that too. Gideon Foyle leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way old lawyers look at people who are right but cannot afford to prove it. The look that says the law is a machine and the machine runs on money and being correct is not the same as being funded. "Victor Hale bought your debt from the bank," Foyle said. "Legally, that is permitted. The bank sells distressed debt to third parties at a discount. The third party then pursues the full value. It is predatory, it is effective, and it is unfortunately not illegal." "What about the assessment?" Maggie asked. "Boyd Sutter tripled my property value in 2 years. Nobody else on the block went up, just me." Foyle nodded slowly. "You would need to file a formal challenge with the county assessor's office. The challenge goes before the Board of Equalization. The board reviews the assessment. If they find irregularities, they can order a reassessment." "And who sits on the Board of Equalization?" Foyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Boyd Sutter is an appointed member." The silence in that office lasted longer than it should have. Maggie picked up her purse. She thanked Gideon Foyle for his time. He did not charge her. He walked her to the door and stood there as she went down the stairs, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has spent 50 years inside the law and has never found a way to make it reach the people it was supposed to protect. The third foster home was the farm. It was located outside a town that Nathan would never name even decades later. 30 acres, livestock, fencing that always needed mending. 2 adults who had figured out that the foster system, if managed correctly, would supply them with labor and call it caregiving. Nathan arrived in March. He was 9 years old. The man who ran the property was large, sun-darkened, and did not shake Nathan's hand. He did not introduce his wife. He did not show Nathan the house. He showed him a cot in a room attached to the barn, a room that smelled like hay and animal waste, and the particular cold that seeps into uninsulated spaces and never fully leaves, and said, "Up before dawn, no exceptions." For 18 months, Nathan Archer woke in the dark. He fed chickens. He mucked stalls. He carried fence posts that weighed more than he did across fields that seemed to stretch wider every morning. His hands blistered. The blisters broke. The skin beneath them hardened into something that did not blister again. He was 9 years old and his palms looked like a working man's. Any complaint was met with what the adults called discipline. The man had a belt he kept on a hook by the kitchen door. Not unlike the hook where Maggie had hung her husband's flannel shirt, except this hook held something designed to teach a different kind of lesson. The belt came off the hook when Nathan was too slow, too loud, too visible, or when the man had been drinking, which was most evenings after 7. The sound of that belt clearing the hook was a sound Nathan learned to hear through walls, through closed doors, through sleep. The body learns to listen for the sounds that precede pain, even when the mind is resting. Nathan does not linger on this part of the story. He mentions the farm the way a man mentions a road he had to drive through to reach his destination. Not the point, just the route. But the route leaves marks. The route teaches things about the world that a child should not learn at 9. It teaches that adults who are given power over children without oversight will sometimes use that power in the ugliest ways available to them. It teaches that systems designed to protect children can become through neglect and underfunding in the quiet indifference of people who have too many files on their desks, systems that deliver children directly into harm. He was removed from the farm when he was 10, a school nurse noticed. Not the bruises, those were in places the clothes covered, but the weight loss. A boy who should have been growing was shrinking instead. A report was filed, an investigation was opened. The investigation moved at the speed of bureaucracy, which is to say slowly, which is to say that Nathan spent 4 more months on that farm before anyone with authority arrived to take him out. 4 more months of mornings before dawn. 4 more months of the belt clearing the hook. The town council meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the basement of the municipal building. Fluorescent lights, folding chairs. A table at the front with 5 council members who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Maggie Dawson sat in the 3rd row and waited for her name to be called. She had prepared. She had printed the property tax records for her block going back 7 years. She had highlighted the years where her assessment diverged from every comparable property within a quarter mile. She had a folder with documents. She had numbers. She had the quiet certainty of a woman who had been running a diner for 40 years and knew how to read a ledger. When her name was called, she stood and walked to the front. She laid her documents on the table. She spoke clearly. She explained the discrepancy. She pointed to the numbers. She said the name Boyd Sutter. The council listened. Boyd Sutter was not present. He did not need to be. His name hung in the room the way certain names hang in small towns, attached to other names connected to favors and arrangements, and the kind of quiet agreements that never appear in meeting minutes. Victor Hale was present. He sat in the back row, gray suit, no tie, the posture of a man who attends these meetings, not because he has to, but because he finds it useful to be seen in rooms where decisions are made. When Maggie finished speaking, he stood. He did not approach the front. He spoke from where he was, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough warmth to sound reasonable. "I appreciate Margaret's concern for her property," he said, using her first name, the way a man uses a first name when he wants to make someone smaller. "But the assessments are conducted by the county according to standard methodology. Property values in this area have increased. That's development. That's progress. I'm only trying to invest in this community." He paused. Let the word community sit in the air. Let it do the work a word like that does in a room full of people who are afraid their town is dying. "With all due respect," he said, and in those 4 words was everything. "Mrs. Dawson is understandably upset, but this is a matter for the assessor's office, not the town council." The council chair nodded. One of the members looked at Maggie with something that might have been sympathy but was definitely not action. The matter was tabled. The meeting moved on. Maggie gathered her documents. Her hands were steady. She walked out of the basement and into the parking lot and sat in her car for 10 minutes before she started the engine. She was not crying, she was thinking. There is a particular kind of thinking that happens when a woman who has been told her whole life that the system works discovers at 63 years old that the system works exactly the way it was designed to, and she is not the one it was designed for. Nathan's 7th foster home was a house in a suburb with a lawn and a dog and a woman named Patricia who asked him what he wanted for dinner on his first night. She let him choose. That had never happened before. He stood in the kitchen of a house that smelled like laundry detergent and baked something standing on clean tile in socks that did not have holes in them, and he was asked what he wanted to eat. The question paralyzed him. Not because he didn't have an answer, because having an answer meant having a preference, and having a preference meant caring, and caring meant risk. He chose spaghetti because it was the only food he could think of that felt like something a family would eat together at a table. He was 13. He had been through 6 homes. He had learned to arrive with no expectations, to unpack nothing, to keep his bag packed and stored under the bed, in case the phone call came. And it always came. But Patricia was different. She had a way of being present without being intrusive. She asked questions but accepted silence as a valid answer. She had a bookshelf in the hallway with more books than Nathan had ever seen in a home, and she told him he could read any of them anytime, and that the reading lamp in his room worked until he decided to turn it off. She did not hover. She did not smother. She occupied space the way a warm room occupies space, present and available without demanding anything. He stayed 4 months. He started sleeping through the night for the first time since the farm. He ate dinner at the table. He did his homework at the kitchen counter while Patricia graded papers. She was a retired teacher, and the sound of 2 pencils working in the same room was a sound he had not known he needed to hear. He went to school every day. He began to feel in a way he could not have articulated that the ground beneath him might hold. One evening, Patricia was doing dishes. Nathan was drying. She handed him a plate, and he said, "Thank you, ma'am." And then without thinking, without any of the calculations he had learned to run before opening his mouth, he almost said it. The word, the one that sat at the bottom of everything, the one he had been carrying since he was 7. Mom. It rose in his throat like a bubble. He felt it behind his teeth. He caught it, held it there, swallowed it back down. Because the last time he had trusted someone enough to let that word form in his mouth, the world had answered with a county car and a window going away. He did not say it, but Patricia heard the silence where it should have been. She set down the dish she was washing. She dried her hands on the towel, and she looked at him with something in her face that he would not understand until he was much older. It was the face of a woman who knew exactly what had almost happened and was grieving the fact that it hadn't. 3 weeks later, the caseworker called. Nathan was being transferred. The reason given was behavioral concerns. He had not had a single behavioral incident, not one, but somewhere in a file in a system that processed children the way a post office processes packages, someone had checked a box. Too difficult to manage. Placement destabilized. He packed his bag. He put it by the front door. Patricia stood in the hallway with her arms crossed, not in anger, but in the posture of a woman trying to hold herself together. She had made phone calls. She had filed objections. The system had answered the way the system always answers, with procedure, with policy, with a car in the driveway at 9 in the morning. Nathan walked to the door. He did not look back at Patricia. He could not, because looking back was the thing that cost the most, and he had learned by 13 to economize his losses. He ran at 14, walked out of the 9th placement on a November morning, and did not stop. $11 in his pocket. A bus ticket he had saved for 3 months by collecting returnable cans from the recycling bins behind the middle school. No plan except away. Away from the homes, away from the files, away from the adults who came and went and signed papers and shook hands and never once asked him what he wanted. 8 months on the streets of a mid-sized city he will not name. He ate when he could, slept where it was safe, which was almost nowhere, learned which doorways were covered and which were exposed, learned how to read a block, a crowd, a face, learned the geometry of survival, which is knowing how much distance to keep between yourself and every other human being at all times. Learned that a parking garage on the 3rd level is warmer than the street because heat rises and concrete holds it. Learned that the dumpster behind a bakery is the best dumpster because bread is thrown out at the end of every day, and bread does not spoil as fast as other things. 14 years old and invisible in America, a particular kind of invisible that nobody who has not lived it fully understands, because the world has opinions about homeless adults. It has programs and shelters and occasionally compassion. But a 14-year-old boy sleeping behind a gas station dumpster in November does not fit the categories. He is too old for cute, too young for pity. He exists in a gap the system does not acknowledge because acknowledging it would require admitting that the system itself created him. He does not tell this part with self-pity. He tells it the way a man tells a story about whether he survived. It happened. It was cold. He got through it. He had been on the street for about 2 months on the night everything changed, November. A city somewhere in the middle of the country, behind an auto repair shop, out of the wind, going through a dumpster for anything useful. Not proud of it, not ashamed of it either. Just doing what you do when the alternative is nothing. The back door of the shop opened. A rectangle of warm yellow light spilled across the asphalt. A man stepped out with a coffee mug in one hand and the other hand in his jacket pocket. He was late 40s, maybe 50. Heavy through the shoulders and chest, the build of a man who had been strong in his 20s and had maintained it through labor rather than vanity. His face had lines that were not from age alone. It was the face of a man who had served overseas, who had seen enough in a place far from home that his features had stopped performing surprise a long time ago. He wore a vest, leather, patches. He looked at Nathan for a long moment, did not reach for a phone, did not raise his voice, did not tell him to move along. He stood in the cold with steam rising from his coffee and looked at the boy behind his dumpster with an expression that was not pity and not judgment and not charity. It was recognition. The recognition of one person who has been in the dark looking at another person who is in the dark right now. He asked one question. You running from the wall or from life? Nathan looked up at him from beside the dumpster. 14 years old, dirty, thin, tired in a way that sleep does not fix. The flannel shirt was gone. It had been taken from him at the fourth foster home, confiscated as non-regulation clothing, and he had grieved it the way a soldier grieves a talisman. Something protective, something that carried the last good memory gone. Neither one's been that interested in me, he said. Emmett Brennan road name, Iron Full Patch member for 26 years, chapter sergeant at arms for 12, almost smiled. It was not a full smile. It was the corner of the mouth moving a fraction of an inch. The kind of almost smile that happens when a man who has heard every lie recognizes the sound of the truth. Come inside, he said. It's cold. That was the sentence. That was the entire intervention. No intake form, no assessment, no evaluation of risk factors and protective factors and placement suitability scores. A man with a coffee mug and a back door and enough life behind him to recognize what he was looking at. The next morning, Iron gave Nathan a choice. Not a speech, not a lecture, not a pamphlet or a program or a promise. A choice. Two options. Binary. Work or leave. There was a cot in the back of the shop. There were rules. Show up at 6, do the work. Do not lie, do not steal. Do not bring chaos through that door. No pity, no exceptions, no second chances on the things that mattered. Nathan stayed. He learned how an engine works from the inside out. How to read the sound a motor makes the way a doctor reads a heartbeat. Where to put his hands. When to use force and when to use patience. He learned that a man who takes apart something broken and puts it back together, working is doing a kind of work that matters beyond the machine. He learned that discipline, when it is attached to building something, rather than punishing someone, feels entirely different in the body. It does not make you smaller. It makes you steady. Iron did not talk much. He taught through proximity, through demonstration, through the wordless language of a man handing a wrench to a boy and pointing at a bolt and waiting. He did not tell Nathan he was proud of him. He told him when a job was done wrong. He told him when a job was done right. Both statements were delivered in the same flat tone, and Nathan learned to hear the difference by watching Iron's hands rather than listening to his voice. When Iron was satisfied, his hands rested. When he was not, his thumb rubbed across the scar on his knuckle. Once, twice, then stopped. Nathan earned his prospect patch at 17. Full patch at 20. He became a member of Emmett Brennan's chapter, and that chapter became the first family Nathan Archer had ever belonged to that did not eventually ask him to leave. He went by Nate now. The name Nathan belonged to a boy who had pressed his face against a car window. Nate was the man who had walked through what came after and was still standing. Being part of that world meant operating in gray areas. Nate collected debts for people. He stood in doorways during disagreements so that the disagreements stayed verbal and did not become physical. He was present in rooms where his presence alone was the message, where the width of his shoulders and the ink on his arms and the patch on his vest communicated things that did not need to be spoken. He does not ask anyone to call that clean. He does not call it clean himself, but he also did not drink his money away. He did not spend it on the things young men in that life often spend it on. He saved, quietly, consistently, with a patience that looked strange to the men around him until you understood what he was building toward. He had been building toward it since he was 7, back in the present, back in the town that was forgetting Margaret Dawson existed. She came home from the council meeting to an empty diner. She locked the front door. She turned off the lights except for the one above the grill, the one that flickered, the one she had not fixed. She sat on a stool at her own counter and looked at the place she had given 4 decades of her life, the ceramic mugs on their hooks, the specials board she had written on that morning in chalk, the corner booth where she had sat across from a 7-year-old boy and let him eat in silence because she understood that silence was what he needed, the flannel shirt on the hook. She had hung a new one there after the original went with Nathan. Same color, same plaid. She had found it at a thrift store 3 months after the boy was taken, and she had hung it on the same hook because the hook could not be empty. But it was not the same shirt. It did not carry the same weight. It was a stand-in for something that was gone, and she knew it, and the knowing was the thing she lived with. She could sell. Victor Hale would make the offer the moment the foreclosure went through. He would buy the property for less than it was worth and call it a fair deal, and she would sign because she would have no choice. She would lose the building, the name, the counter where she had poured coffee for every regular who had ever trusted her to remember what they needed before they asked. She could fight, but fight with what? She had numbers that proved the assessment was rigged, and no one with the authority to act on those numbers was interested in acting. She had the truth, and the truth in a room full of people who benefit from the lie is just noise. She looked at the flannel shirt. She thought about her husband who had fixed things without being asked. She thought about the boy whose face she still saw some mornings when she was pouring coffee pressed against the rear window going away. She wondered where he was. She wondered if he was alive. She wondered if he remembered 9 days in a storage room, or if those 9 days had been buried under whatever came after because whatever came after, she knew, had not been kind. It was late. The town was quiet. The flannel shirt hung on its hook and did not move. 3 states away in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and industrial floor cleaner, Emmett Iron Brennan was dying. Lung cancer, diagnosed late the way it is always diagnosed late in men who do not go to doctors because they have spent their lives distrusting every institution that has ever asked them to sit in a waiting room. By the time Iron coughed blood into a shop rag and let Nate drive him to the VA hospital, the scans showed what the scans always show when a man waits too long: shadows in both lungs, shadows that had been building while he was building engines. Nate sat with him through the end, drove him to appointments Iron hated, cooked food Iron barely touched, did not make it sentimental because Iron would have hated that more than the cancer. They talked about engines. They talked about use that needed finishing at the shop. They talked about a transmission rebuild that Nate had quoted too low, and Iron had told him twice to reprice, and Nate had not because the customer was a single mother and the car was the only way her kids got to school. Iron shook his head at that. "You're going to go broke being decent," he said. "Learned it from you," Nate said. Iron looked at him. His face was thinner now. The cheekbones showed in a way they never had when he was healthy. His hands, those hands that had taught Nate everything he knew about machines and patience and how to hold a wrench without gripping it too hard, lay on the hospital blanket like tools someone had set down for the last time. "There's something I never told you," Iron said. Nate waited. 1995, Iron said. "I was riding through a small town on the way to a rally in Tennessee. Stopped for gas. There was a diner across the street. Dawson's, I think. Had a piece of paper taped to the front window." Nate did not move. It said missing. It had a name, Nathan Archer, 7 years old, phone number at the bottom. The room was silent except for the monitors. The machines that measured what was left of Iron's lungs drew lines on a screen that Nate had learned to read over the past 3 months. Lines that were getting shallower, moving slower, telling a story that had only one ending. "I didn't think anything of it then," Iron said. "A missing kid poster in a diner window. You see them, you move on. It was years later when I was going through your paperwork for the shop insurance that I saw your full name, Nathan Archer, and I remembered that window." Nate's hands were on his knees. His knuckles were white. "She was looking for you," Iron said. "That woman. She put your name in the window and left it there. I saw it in 95. It had already been there a while. The paper was starting to yellow." He paused. His breathing was slower now. Each exhale cost something. I should have told you sooner. I kept meaning to. Then the diagnosis came and I thought, let the boy focus. But I'm telling you now because you need to know. Somebody was looking for you the whole time. Somebody kept your name in the window. Nate sat in that hospital room for a long time after Iron fell asleep. He did not move. He did not speak. He looked at the man who had opened a door for him on a cold November night, and he thought about a woman who had taped a piece of paper to a window and left it there for years, and he understood something he had not understood before. He had never been forgotten. The two people who had saved his life, the woman with the diner and the man with the shop, had existed in the same world separated by a few hundred miles in the chaos of a broken system, and neither of them had known about the other. Maggie had searched. Iron had sheltered. And somewhere between the searching and the sheltering, a boy had survived. Iron died on a Wednesday, 68 years old. He died with Nate in the room, which is more than most people get. The shop was quiet. The chapter came. They stood in the parking lot and did not speak because there are silences among men like that which carry more than any eulogy. They stood with their hands at their sides or in their pockets, and they looked at the ground or at the sky, and they did not leave until the hearse did, because you do not leave before the man you followed leaves, and that is a rule that is not written anywhere and does not need to be. The will was read the following week. Nobody expected what it said. Iron left Nate the auto shop, a legitimate, profitable business that Iron had run clean for the last 12 years of his life, his own version of building towards something better. The chapter assumed Nate would expand, open a second bay, maybe use the location as a base for the business side of operations. It made sense. It was the practical move. It was what any man in Nate's position would do. Nate let them think that for about 2 weeks. Then he listed it. He sold the shop for $294,000. He did it quietly. He signed the papers in a lawyer's office and walked out with a cashier's check and a face that gave nothing away. When the brothers in his chapter asked why he said 7 words, I made a promise when I was 7. Most of them did not understand. They would understand later. They would understand when they saw where the money went and who it went to and what it built. And 600 miles east, on the same night that Nate Archer sold everything Emmett Brennan had left him, Margaret Dawson sat alone in a dark diner and stared at a flannel shirt on a hook and tried to find a reason to open the doors in the morning. She was 63 years old. She was tired in the way that tired becomes when it is no longer about sleep. She had fought. She had stood in front of a council. She had printed documents and highlighted numbers and spoken clearly, and none of it had mattered because the system does not care about clarity. It cares about leverage. And she had none. The foreclosure notice sat on the counter. 48 hours. Less now. She reached out and touched the flannel shirt. The fabric was soft in the way that fabric becomes soft after years of hanging in the same place. She pressed it against her face. It did not smell like Thomas anymore. This was not even his shirt. But she held it there anyway because some gestures are not about what is present. They are about what was. She thought about closing, walking away, letting Victor Hale have the lot and the building and the knee and being done with it. She thought about what it would feel like to drive away from this place and not look back. But she had seen a boy do that once, a boy who did not look back because looking back was the thing that cost the most. And she had spent 29 years wondering what that cost him. She hung the shirt back on the hook. She wiped the counter one more time. She turned off the last light. 2 timelines. 2 people who had been connected by 9 days and separated by 29 years. Both of them standing at the bottom of something in the dark with nothing left except the thing that had kept them going all along. A promise, one had made it, one had received it, and neither of them knew yet that the distance between those 2 darknesses was about to collapse into 600 miles of highway and the sound of 6 engines at sunrise. Nate Archer spent 3 years becoming something no one in his chapter had ever seen before. A man with grease under his fingernails sitting in a county clerk's office at 9 in the morning requesting public records. A man with a full patch vest folded in his saddlebag, walking into a real estate attorney's office in a collared shirt he had bought at a thrift store because he did not own one. A man who had learned how to read a room full of dangerous people, now learning how to read a room full of legal documents, which as it turned out required a different kind of patience, but the same ability to identify where the threat was hiding. He started with the debt. Margaret Dawson's financial life was not complicated. It was the financial life of a woman who had spent 40 years doing one thing and doing it honestly. She had a mortgage on the diner that she had been paying down for 3 decades. She had a credit line she had used twice, both times to repair equipment, a new compressor for the walk-in cooler in 2019, a replacement grill top in 2021. She had medical bills from a surgery 2 years prior, a hip replacement that her insurance had fought for 4 months, and then partially denied, leaving her with a balance that sat on her kitchen table like a stone she could not move. She had property taxes. And this is where Nate's education began. He pulled the tax records for every property on Dawson's block going back 10 years. He did it legally through the county assessor's public database, sitting in a library 2 states away with a laptop that Iron had bought him 3 years before the cancer and a legal pad covered in numbers that would have made no sense to anyone who did not know what he was looking for. The librarian glanced at him once at the tattoos and the size of him, and then went back to her work, because librarians are the kind of people who judge a man by what he's reading, not what he's wearing. The numbers told a story. Every property on the block had seen modest increases, 3%, 5%, consistent with regional trends. Every property except one. Dawson's Diner had been assessed upward by 19% in 2020, 23% in 2021, 31% in 2022. The cumulative effect was a tripling of the tax burden in 3 years. A burden that a woman running a diner in a dying town could not carry. A burden that was never meant to be carried. It was meant to crush. The assessor's name was on every filing. Boyd Sutter, county assessor for 14 years. Appointed, not elected, which meant he answered to the county board, which meant he answered to the people who influenced the county board, which meant he answered in the quiet way that such things work in small towns, to the man who had been buying properties on that block for 3 decades. Victor Hale had not needed to break any laws. He had simply needed to know someone who could adjust a number in a database and make it look routine. The beauty of the scheme, if you could call cruelty beautiful, was its patience. No single year's increase was dramatic enough to trigger automatic review. Each adjustment was defensible in isolation. It was only when you laid them side by side year after year that the pattern became visible. A slow, methodical compression, a vice made of paperwork. The kind of violence that wears a tie and files on time and never once raises its voice. Nate learned how debt purchasing works. He learned that when a borrower falls behind, the original lender will sometimes sell that debt to a third party. The third party pays a fraction of the face value, sometimes 10 cents on the dollar, sometimes less, and then pursues collection of the full amount. It is legal. It is common. It is the financial equivalent of buying a weapon someone else manufactured and pointing it at a person who cannot afford a shield. Victor Hale had purchased Maggie's medical debt from the collection agency for $11,000. The face value was $67,000. He had purchased her credit card balances for roughly 8 cents on the dollar. He had acquired the delinquent property tax lien from the county, and he had assembled these instruments into a single foreclosure action filed through an LLC that bore no obvious connection to his name, because men like Victor Hale do not put their names on the things they use to hurt people. They put their names on the buildings they construct afterward. Nate sat with this information for 2 weeks. He sat with it the way Iron had taught him to sit with a problem. Do not react. Do not move until you understand the entire machine. Find the part that, if removed, causes the rest of it to stop functioning. Iron used to say that about engines, but it applied to everything. Every system has a part that holds the rest of it together. Find that part. Then decide what to do with it. Then he called a real estate attorney named Fiona Caldwell. She was 46 years old, practiced out of a second-floor office above a barbershop, and had a reputation for taking cases that larger firms considered unprofitable. Which is to say, she had a reputation for caring about things that did not generate billable hours. Her office was small. Her desk was covered in files. She had a photograph on the wall of herself at 25, standing in front of the Supreme Court building, a young woman with an idealism that the photograph had preserved even if the years had complicated it. He sat across from her desk and laid out every document he had gathered. Tax records, assessment comparisons, debt purchase records obtained through public filing searches, the LLC structure Hale had used to obscure his ownership of Maggie's debt, the timeline. He had organized everything in folders. He had labeled the folders with a marker in handwriting that was surprisingly precise for a man whose hands were built for wrenches. Fiona Caldwell looked at the documents for 20 minutes without speaking. She turned pages. She cross-referenced numbers. She pulled a calculator from her desk drawer and ran figures that confirmed what the documents already showed. Then she looked at Nate, at the tattoos covering both arms, at the vest he had not worn into the office but which she could see folded on the chair beside him, at the scar through his eyebrow. "Who is she to you?" Fiona asked. Nate said, "She fed me when I was 7. I slept in her storage room for 9 days. Then the state took me and she spent 2 years trying to find me." Fiona was quiet for a moment. The office was quiet. The barber shop below them was not quiet. Somebody was getting a trim, and the barber was talking about the weather. But in this room, in this moment, two people were sitting with the kind of silence that happens when one person has just said something that changes the shape of the conversation. Then she said, "The assessment manipulation is actionable, but proving it requires Boyd Sutter's cooperation or a forensic audit the county will never authorize. The debt purchases are legal. The foreclosure filing is procedurally sound." "So there's nothing," Nate said. "I didn't say that. I said the attack is legal. I said the defense through the system is weak. But there is another option." She leaned forward. "You can do what Hale did. You can buy the debt." The logic was simple. Debt once sold can be sold again. If Nate could acquire Maggie's obligations before the foreclosure was finalized, the action would collapse. No debt, no default. No default, no foreclosure. The deed stays with the owner. It would require money. It would require speed. And it would require convincing the current debt holders to sell to him rather than allowing Hale's foreclosure to proceed, because a foreclosure recovery would yield them the full face value while a third-party purchase would yield them pennies. "Hale's LLC is the debt holder of record," Fiona said. "You would need to make them an offer they find more attractive than the foreclosure proceeds." "What makes a foreclosure less attractive?" "Delay, litigation, publicity, anything that increases cost or risk." Nate understood. He had spent years in rooms where leverage was not about who had the most. It was about who was willing to use what they had. He began with Boyd Sutter. He did not threaten Boyd Sutter. He did not visit Boyd Sutter's home or his office or anywhere that could be described as confrontational. He sat down across from Boyd Sutter at a diner in a town neither of them lived, in a diner chosen specifically because it was not Dawson's and not anywhere near the county where Sutter held his appointment. He had found Sutter through public records. He had called him on his personal phone, which was also public record, and he had said, "I would like to show you some documents over coffee." And something in his voice, or perhaps in the specificity of the request, made Sutter agree. He laid out the tax assessment records, all of them, side by side. He showed Sutter his own signature on every filing. He showed him the comparison with every other property on the block. He showed him the timeline and the correlation with Victor Hale's property acquisitions. He laid the documents out in a row on the table the way a mechanic lays out parts on a workbench, each piece in its place, each piece essential to the whole. Boyd Sutter was 57 years old. He had a wife who taught 3rd grade. He had a pension that he had been paying into for 22 years. He had 17 months until he was eligible for full retirement benefits. He had a face that, as he looked at the documents, did something complicated. The face of a man who has been doing a small, wrong thing for a long time and has just been shown what it looks like assembled in one place. "I am not recording this conversation," Nate said. "I am not here to make your life difficult. I am here to give you a choice." Sutter did not look up from the documents. "You can file a corrected assessment," Nate said. "Retroactive. You can cite a computational error. The county absorbs the overpayment as a credit to the property owner. Nobody asks questions. Nobody investigates. Your name stays clean. Your pension stays intact." He paused. He let the silence do the work. Iron had taught him that too. The most powerful thing a man can say in a negotiation is nothing delivered at the right moment. Or these records go to the state auditor's office, and then it's not a conversation anymore. Sutter stared at the table. His coffee was untouched. His hands were flat on the surface, palms down the way a man places his hands when he is trying to keep them from shaking. I didn't know it was going to go this far, Sutter said. Nate said nothing, because what do you say to a man who adjusted a number in a database and called it a favor, and did not think about the woman on the other end of that number who was pouring coffee at 4 in the morning to keep the lights on? What do you say to a man who moved a decimal point and considered it a small thing and did not understand that small things accumulated over years become the difference between a woman keeping her life and losing it? Sutter filed the corrected assessment the following week. The back taxes were recalculated. The overpayment was credited to the property. One leg of Hale's foreclosure collapsed. The medical debt and the credit card balances remained. Nate used the money from Iron's shop, $294,000. He purchased the medical debt from Hale's LLC through Fiona Caldwell's office for 14 cents on the dollar. He purchased the credit card balances at a similar rate. He did it through a holding entity Fiona established, and he did it quickly before Hale's attorneys could file a motion to accelerate the foreclosure timeline. The total cost was just under $41,000. The remainder of Iron's money went to the second purchase. The building next door. It had been empty for 11 years. Windows boarded, paint peeling in strips that hung like dead skin. A building the town had stopped seeing, the way towns stop seeing things that have been broken long enough. The kind of building that becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because looking at it requires acknowledging that something has been allowed to die. The owner was an estate trust that had been trying to unload the property for 5 years. Nate paid cash, below asking. The trust was happy to be rid of it. Renovations began 6 months before the morning of the envelope. Nate's chapter contributed, not money only, labor. 6 men who knew how to work with their hands showed up on weekends and swung hammers and ran electrical wire and poured concrete and did not ask to be thanked, because that is not how men like that operate. They operate on the understanding that when one of them says this matters, the others show up. That is the code, not the code written on a patch. The code written in the showing up. Now, 600 miles of highway behind them, 6 Harley-Davidsons cooling in the parking lot of Dawson's Diner, sunrise pressing through the front windows and laying gold across the counter, and Nate Archer sitting at the counter where he had once eaten eggs as a 7-year-old boy, setting down an envelope thick enough to change a life. Maggie opened it with hands that were not steady. She was 63 years old. Her hands had been steady for 40 years of pouring coffee, and they were not steady now. Inside the envelope, arranged in order, each document clipped separately, each one carrying the weight of a different chain being removed. The medical debt, paid in full, a letter from the collection agency confirming zero balance. Her name typed at the top. Margaret Dawson, balance $0. She read it twice. She ran her finger under her name. She had seen her name on bills for so long that seeing it next to a zero felt like a misprint. The credit card balances, settled. Confirmation letters from both issuers. 0. 0. The property tax correction. A letter from the county assessor's office acknowledging the computational error. A credit applied to the account. Back taxes eliminated. The foreclosure notice withdrawn. A letter from Hale's LLC attorneys confirming that due to the resolution of all underlying obligations, the foreclosure action had been dismissed. And at the bottom of the stack, beneath everything else, a single document. The deed to Dawson's Diner, free and clear. Margaret Dawson, sole owner. No liens, no encumbrances, no man with a gray suit and a developer's smile standing between her and the building that held her husband's name and her life's work. She held the deed with both hands. She did not speak for almost a full minute. The diner was quiet. The 6 men who had ridden through the night were sitting in booths drinking coffee that one of them had poured himself because Maggie had not moved from the counter and none of them expected her to. They drank quietly. They watched without staring. They gave her the room. Then she spoke. And her voice, when it came, was not the voice of a woman receiving a gift. It was the voice of a woman laying down a weight she had carried for 29 years. I broke my promise, she said. I let them take you. Nate looked at her. His hands were around his coffee mug, both hands the way Iron used to hold his. His eyes were steady, the same steadiness she had seen in the rear window of a county car in 1994, except now it was not the steadiness of a child who expected nothing. It was the steadiness of a man who had built something from the wreckage of that expectation. You kept me alive long enough to survive, he said. Those words landed in the room the way certain words land when they have been carried for decades. They did not echo. They settled. Into the counter, into the ceramic mugs on their hooks, into the flannel shirt on the door, into every corner of the diner that had been waiting without knowing it for the sentence that would make 40 years of showing up mean something beyond showing up. Maggie looked at him. She reached across the counter. She did not touch his hand. She touched the edge of his vest, the leather near the red emblem badge. She touched it the way you touch something you are trying to believe is real. Her fingers rested there for a moment. Then she pulled her hand back and pressed it against her own chest as if she was putting something away for safekeeping. "Sit down," Nate said. "Eat first." The same 3 words she had said to him in 1994. Spoken back to her now 29 years later by the man that boy had become. The roles reversed. The child caring for the woman who had cared for him. The same words. An entirely different meaning. Maggie sat. One of the bikers brought her a plate. Eggs toast. She looked at it and something in her face broke open in a way that was not breaking down but breaking through. She ate. For the first time in weeks, she ate without the wait. The front door opened at 8:40. Victor Hale walked in. He had heard. In small towns, news travels before coffee cools. Someone had called him. Someone had told him about the motorcycles, about the envelope, about the woman sitting at the counter holding a deed that should not have existed. He came through the door the way he always entered rooms, with the posture of a man who owned things and expected the world to confirm it. Gray suit, no tie, the same calm, measured presence he had carried into the town council, meeting the same controlled warmth, the same performance of reasonableness. He stopped 3 steps inside. The diner was not what he expected. 6 men in leather vests occupied the booths, large men, calm men. Men who looked at him with the unhurried attention of people who have been in enough rooms to know when someone has walked into the wrong one. Coffee mugs in their hands, breakfast on their plates. Nothing threatening, nothing aggressive, just presence. The kind of presence that fills a room without raising its voice. "Margaret," Hale said. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge in it now that had not been there at the council meeting. The edge of a man who has just discovered that a mechanism he had built and tested and trusted has been dismantled while he was not looking. "I don't know what you think has happened here, but my attorneys will be reviewing every document. If there has been any irregularity in the transfer of those obligations, I will pursue it." He said the word pursue the way he said every word. Carefully, precisely, with the implied weight of a man who has resources and is not afraid to deploy them. Maggie did not respond. She did not need to. Nate stood up from the counter. He did not speak. He did not make a fist. He did not step forward or puff his chest or do any of the things that men do when they want to appear threatening. He simply stood. All of him. The full height and width and weight of a man who had spent 22 years in a world where presence was currency. The tattoos, the vest, the scar, the hands that had rebuilt engines and collected debts and held a dying man's coffee mug and now rested at his sides with the relaxed stillness of someone who did not need to perform anything because the truth was already on the counter in a stack of legally filed documents. Behind him, one by one, the 6 men in the booth set down their coffee mugs. They did not stand. They did not need to. They shifted, adjusted, opened their postures in a way that said without a single word, "We are here and we are not leaving. And whatever you are considering doing next, you should reconsider it." The room was very still. Hale looked at Nate. He looked at the men in the booths. He looked at the envelope on the counter and the documents spread across its surface. His jaw moved once the way a man's jaw moves when he is swallowing something he wanted to say. The front door opened again. The bell rang. The sheriff walked in, late 50s, belt below his stomach, mustache that had been out of style for 20 years, eyes that scanned the room the way law enforcement eyes scan every room they enter, measuring the geometry of the space, identifying who was where and what their hands were doing. Someone had called. A nervous local had seen 6 motorcycles and then Victor Hale's silver sedan pulling into the same parking lot at the same time, and that combination of vehicles had been enough to justify a phone call. "Morning," the sheriff said. He looked at Hale. He looked at Nate. He looked at Maggie behind the counter. Nate reached for the stack of documents and held them out. The sheriff took them. He read slowly. He was not a fast reader, but he was a thorough one. The kind of man who had spent 30 years reading incident reports and had learned that the details matter more than the summary. He turned each page. He looked at the letterheads. He looked at the signatures. He looked at the deed. Then he looked at Victor Hale. "Everything here checks out, Victor," he said. His voice was flat, not hostile, not sympathetic. The voice of a man who has learned that the law is the law regardless of who is standing in front of him. The voice of a man who has also learned that the law properly applied occasionally produces justice, and that when it does, the correct response is to stand out of its way. Hale stood very still, his mouth open, closed. He looked at Maggie one more time. She met his eyes. She did not look away. She did not flinch. She held his gaze with the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who had been afraid of this man for years and was no longer afraid. 29 years of guilt and grief and 4 in the morning coffee and showing up and holding on and being told she was just a woman with a dying diner in a dying town, and now she was sitting behind her own counter, holding her own deed, and she was not afraid. Hale turned and walked out. The bell above the door rang once. His sedan started in the parking lot. He drove away. He did not come back. The room exhaled. The sheriff watched the sedan disappear down the road. Then he turned back to the counter. He took off his hat, set it on the counter, pulled out a stool, and sat down. "I'll have eggs," he said. "Over easy." One of the bikers laughed, a short laugh, low, the kind that breaks tension without breaking the moment. Another one shook his head and grinned into his coffee. Maggie stood up. She walked behind the counter. She tied on her apron, the same apron she had been tying on for 40 years, and the gesture was so practiced and so automatic that her hands did it without her mind being involved, and there was something beautiful about that. About a woman's hands knowing exactly where the strings go because they have tied them 10,000 times. She cooked the sheriff his eggs because that is what she had been doing for 40 years, and the building was hers, and the name on the door was hers, and nobody was taking it. Then Nate slid a second document across the counter. A property deed for the building next door. The one that had been empty for 11 years. The one with the boarded windows and the peeling paint that nobody saw anymore. "Renovations are almost done," he said. "We've been working on it for 6 months. The building was going to become Brennan House, named for Emmett Iron Brennan, the man who had opened a back door on a cold November night and asked the right question at exactly the right time. A community resource center. Not a charity, not a program, a place for foster youth aging out of the system. The ones who turn 18 and are handed a garbage bag with their belongings and told good luck. The ones who have been prepared for nothing and blamed for everything and who walk out of their last placement into a world that does not know they exist. The ones who are at this very moment in some town in America sitting on a curb outside a building wondering if the person inside is kind, and for veterans who came home to a country that had already moved on. Men who served and returned to discover that the gratitude lasted about as long as the parade, and that the systems designed to help them were as understaffed and underfunded and indifferent as the systems that had failed Nathan. Hot meals, every day. Because Nate understood in a way that only a person who has been hungry truly understands that feeding someone is not about the food. It is about the act. It is about someone deciding that your hunger matters enough to do something about it. Trade skill training, welding, mechanics, electrical, the kind of skills that produce employment, the kind that give a person something to do with their hands at 6 in the morning that is not survival, but construction. Building something, becoming someone who builds things. Iron had given Nate a wrench and pointed at a bolt and waited, and that waiting, that patience, that wordless transfer of skill from one man's hands to another had saved a life. Brennan House was going to do that at scale. Mentorship. Not the kind that comes with brochures and mission statements. The kind that comes from a man who has rebuilt a transmission sitting next to a boy who has rebuilt nothing yet and showing him how the parts fit. The kind Iron had given Nate. Proximity, patience, presence. The quiet transfer of competence from one set of hands to another. The Hells Angels chapter had funded a significant portion of the renovation. Every man on that crew in the parking lot had contributed. Time, money, labor. The bikers in the parking lot were not there to intimidate. They were there because they had spent 6 months building something and they wanted to see it through. They were there because one of their brothers had said, "This matters," and when one of them says that, the others show up. 6 months later, Dawson's Diner had a wait on weekends for the first time in a decade. Not because of the story. Stories travel, yes, and this one traveled further than most, but what brought people back was not the story. It was the food and the atmosphere and the feeling that something on this corner of town was alive again. That someone was keeping the lights on, and the coffee hot, and the door open, and that the someone had been doing it for 40 years and was not going to stop. People came from other towns. They drove 30 minutes for breakfast because somebody had told them about the diner on the corner where the eggs were good and the coffee was real, and the woman behind the counter remembered your name after the first visit and your order after the second. They came and they sat at the counter and they looked at the flannel shirt on the hook and the photograph on the wall, and they asked questions, and Maggie answered some of them and smiled at the rest and poured them more coffee. Brennan House opened its doors 4 months after the morning of the envelope. By the end of the first month, it was serving over 200 people a week. The welding program had a waiting list. 3 foster youth who had aged out of the system with nothing completed their first certifications. One of them, a girl named Delia, who was 19 and had been in 11 placements, got a job at a fabrication shop 30 minutes away and showed up every day for her first month without missing once. When someone asked her how, she said, "A man told me the only rule is show up." A 62-year-old veteran named Dennis, who had served 2 tours overseas and come home to a marriage that didn't survive, and a VA system that put him on a 6-month waiting list for an appointment he needed in 6 days, started coming to Brennan House 3 mornings a week. He was paired with a 19-year-old named Marcus, who had been sleeping in his car. Dennis taught Marcus how to rebuild a transmission. What he was actually teaching him was how to show up somewhere every morning with a reason. Marcus did not know that yet. He would know it later. He would know it when he was Dennis's age and teaching someone else's kid how to use a torque wrench. And he would remember the morning Dennis handed him his first ratchet and said, "This one's yours. Don't lose it." The sheriff began quietly referring teenagers he was worried about to Brennan House. Kids he kept seeing in the wrong places at the wrong times. Kids who were not yet in the system but were standing at its edge looking in. He did not fill out paperwork. He did not make official referrals. He drove them there himself and said, "Go talk to Nate." And Nate talked to them, or more accurately, Nate did not talk to them. He handed them a wrench and pointed at a bolt and waited the way iron had done for him, because some lessons cannot be taught with words. They can only be taught with patience and a tool and the willingness to stand beside someone while they figure it out. Maggie was sleeping again, really sleeping. Not the thin, shallow sleep of a woman whose mind runs numbers in the dark. Deep sleep, the kind that comes when the weight you have been carrying for years finally has somewhere to rest. She woke up at 4 because 40 years of habit does not change, but she woke up different now. She woke up without the first thought being a calculation of what she owed and to whom and how many days she had before the next letter arrived. She woke up and the first thing she thought about was what the special would be today, and whether Earl Hadley would want his eggs scrambled, or if this was a soft-boiled morning, because Mondays were scrambled, but sometimes he changed his mind if it was raining. She was smiling. The regulars noticed. Earl Hadley noticed. The Purcell brothers noticed. They did not mention it because in small towns people understand certain changes the same way they understand certain silences. They see a woman coming back to life and they let her do it without commentary. They just drink their coffee and leave a slightly bigger tip and come back tomorrow. The flannel shirt still hung on the hook by the back office door. Maggie had not moved it, but she had added something next to it. A photograph. Small, unframed, taped to the wall beside the hook. It was a picture Nate had given her. He had found it in the county hospital records buried in Sarah Archer's patient file. A photograph of Sarah holding Nathan as an infant, the only picture of his mother he had ever seen. Sarah was smiling in the photograph. She was young and thin, and her eyes were tired, but her arms around the baby were strong, and the smile was real. It was the smile of a woman who did not yet know what was coming, but who in this moment was holding everything she loved. He had given it to Maggie because he said she should have it, because the woman who had kept his name in the window for 2 years had earned the right to know who had sent him to her. Sarah and Maggie had spoken once on the phone, one conversation, A dying woman and a kind woman and a boy between them who neither of them could save alone. But together across a phone line in 9 days and 29 years they had saved him. Nate did not live in town. He rode through every few weeks. He sat at the counter and drank his coffee, black, and talked to Maggie in the unhurried way of two people who have said the hardest things and now have the luxury of saying the ordinary ones. He told her about Brennan House. She told him about the diner. They talked about the weather. They talked about nothing. They sat in the comfortable silence of people who do not need to fill every moment with words because the words that mattered have already been spoken. Victor Hale's development plans for the block stalled, not dramatically, not through any legal action or public confrontation. They stalled the way a man's plans stall when the cornerstone he was counting on is no longer available, and the town that was supposed to be too tired to notice has started paying attention. The council meetings had more attendees now. Maggie's documents, the ones she had presented and been ignored, began circulating. Not officially. Through coffee conversations, in church parking lots, and the quiet network of people who had lived in that town long enough to know when something smelled wrong. Hale did not leave. Men like Hale do not leave. They recalculate. They wait. They look for the next corner lot, and the next tired owner, and the next Boyd Sutter willing to adjust a number for a favor. But this corner, this lot, this diner was no longer available, and the woman who ran it was no longer alone. Then winter came. One morning in January, the temperature outside was 14 degrees. The kind of cold that makes the air taste like metal and turns breath into something visible before it leaves the mouth. The kind of cold that finds every crack in every window and every gap under every door and reminds you that warmth is something that has to be maintained, that has to be chosen, that does not occur naturally in a world that trends toward cold. Maggie had the heat on and the coffee brewing and the grill warming and the lights on because she opened every morning at 5:30, regardless of weather, regardless of season, regardless of anything, because showing up is what she did. The diner was warm, the windows were fogged at the edges. The smell of coffee and bacon fat and the particular warmth that comes from a grill that has been seasoned by 40 years of breakfasts filled the room the way a heartbeat fills a chest. The front door opened at 6:12. A boy stood in the doorway, 13 years old. His jacket was too thin for the temperature. A windbreaker. The kind of jacket that comes from a donation bin and was designed for October, not January. His face was narrow. His eyes were large and dark, and they moved across the room the way Nathan's eyes had moved across this room 29 years ago. Checking exits, measuring distances, doing the math on whether this place was safe. He stood just inside the entrance, not committing. His body angled toward the door, one shoulder still almost touching the frame, ready to leave if the room gave him any reason to. His hands were in his jacket pockets. His shoes were wet. He had been walking. His cheeks were raw from the cold. His breath was visible, even inside the diner, because his body had not yet absorbed enough warmth to stop producing clouds. Maggie came around the counter. She did not hesitate. She did not ask questions. She did not look at the jacket or the shoes or the eyes that were too old for the face they were in. She walked straight to him the way she had walked toward a 7-year-old boy on a July morning in 1994. The same walk, the same pace, the same decision made in the body before the mind finishes thinking. She said, "Sit down, eat first." The same words the third time, spoken first to a starving boy in 1994 as an act of instinct, spoken back to her by that boy grown as an act of love, and now spoken again by Maggie to a new child standing in a doorway in winter. Not instinct this time, not echo, something deeper. The understanding that this is what the diner is for, this is what she is for, this is what the last 40 years and the next however many she has left are for, to be the person who says those words to the child who needs to hear them. Nate was at the counter. He had ridden in the night before, was staying at the Moel 2 blocks over, had come in for coffee at his usual time. He saw the boy. He did not speak. He did not stand. He did not introduce himself or explain anything or make the moment larger than it needed to be. He moved one stool over. He sat beside the boy. He drank his coffee and let the boy feel what it felt like to have someone nearby who was not going anywhere. Someone large and calm and steady, whose presence said without words, without performance, without any of the things adults usually do when they are trying to be helpful, you are not invisible. I see you, I'm here. The boy ate eggs, toast orange juice. He ate the way hungry children eat when they are not sure the plate will stay. Careful, complete, every bite accounted for. Maggie watched from behind the counter. She was pouring coffee for Earl Hadley, who was pretending to read the newspaper and watching over the top of it, the way old men in diners watch things they care about without admitting they care. The Purcell brothers were in their usual booth. The sheriff was at the far end of the counter eating his eggs over easy, his hat on the stool beside him. Nobody said much. The boy ate. Nate sat beside him. Maggie poured coffee. The diner did what the diner had always done. It held people. It fed them. It let them sit in a room that was warm and lit and occupied by other human beings, and it asked nothing in return except that they show up. Outside, the January sun was climbing above the tree line, and it hit the front window of Dawson's Diner and lit up the room from the east in a way that made everything inside glow. The chrome on the coffee machine caught the light. The ceramic mugs on their hooks threw small shadows on the wall. The flannel shirt on the hook looked for just a moment like someone was wearing it. The photograph of Sarah Archer holding her infant son was taped to the wall beside the hook. The missing person notice was gone. It had been taken down years ago. In its place, on the same window where Maggie had taped a piece of paper with a boy's name and a phone number, and a hope that someone would call, there was now a small sign. It said, "Everyone eats. No exceptions." Nate Archer had nothing at 7 years old except a flannel shirt and 9 days and a woman who saw him. He built the rest himself. And now, on a cold January morning, boy in a thin jacket was learning what Nathan had learned 30 years before. That somewhere in the world there is a counter with a stool and a woman behind it who will put a plate in front of you and ask nothing in return. That is enough. That has always been enough.